Well, welcome to another episode of Christ and Culture. My name is Pastor Jeff Short, and today we're going to be analyzing the documentary that I recently watched on Hulu, the network, the online network, about Norma McCorvey, or as the title of the documentary is, AKA Jane Roe. And this is the woman upon which the Roe v. Wade decision was based and her situation. And in the 1973 decision by the Supreme Court, which legalized abortion in all 50 states, this woman, Norma McCorvey, was the woman in the case Jane Roe. And she won a right, so-called right, by the Supreme Court to have an abortion. Now, the truth of the matter is that she never did have the abortion, and that the supposed rape that she had experienced and that was told about in the trial never actually took place. So she was basically lying when she said that she was raped. And ironically, that is what is going to be issue with her the rest of her life, is whether people can believe her, whether she is being truthful, and whether she's believable, and whether she's willing to basically state the truth and stay with the truth, or whether she's going to wander up and down wherever she happens to be circumstantially. And so the movie, the documentary, the biggest part of the documentary, the most controversial part, and the one that's going to get the most conversation is her supposed deathbed confession before she died a few years ago. And the confession she makes during the documentary, when she looked right into the camera and said, "I never believed in the pro-life cause. I just said what they wanted me to say because they paid me." In other words, she was living a lie when she was confessing to respect human life. See, what happened was, after she became somewhat of a celebrity in the pro-abortion movement, and for a while after the Roe v. Wade decision, she was speaking and she would stand up in front of crowds as a pro-abortion advocate, because she was the star woman upon which Roe v. Wade was based. And so she became quite famous in the pro-abortion movement, although, as the movie states and as people in the movie testify, the pro-abortion movement was not really sure about her, was not really trustworthy of her, because something within her character or the way she spoke or the way she talked, they never really trusted that she was being honest or what she would say. They never knew what she was going to say. She was sort of like a loose cannon. She would say things, her language was coarse and crude, and you never knew what was going to come out of her mouth. So they didn't really embrace her as much as you would think, that here was the woman upon which Roe v. Wade decision was based. And if she had been someone that they could trust, she probably would have been a famous, very famous spokesman for the pro-abortion movement. But as it was, only a few or a handful of pro-abortion advocates would actually have her at the meetings and rallies, and have her usually not speak very long, but just make an appearance and maybe answer some questions from reporters, but that was about it. And so there was a sense at some point in the pro-abortion movement activity of her younger days that she was feeling slighted by that movement, according to this documentary. And then along that same time, years after the Roe v. Wade decision, she was befriended by Christians and basically loved by Christians and accepted and treated very nice and kind, even though they were totally opposed to what she was doing in her pro-life activism. And eventually, she was converted over into the pro-life position, and she became a Christian, first a Protestant Christian, then years after that, she became a Roman Catholic Christian, And she continued to speak against abortion, and she began to speak out forcefully for the pro-life cause. And I believe she actually spoke a few times, at least once, at the big March for Life in Washington in January every year, which draws hundreds of thousands of people. So she became sort of a pro-life movement spokesman. And that was the way it was until this documentary hit, which basically tried to demonstrate or show that she never really did embrace the pro-life cause. It was just because of the money that she received for doing that activity. And so we're confronted with kind of a puzzling life here. Here was a woman who was selected by the pro-abortion movement to be the plaintiff in a case whose aim was to reverse all the abortion laws and make abortion totally legal. So she was selected for her situation because of her pregnancy and her claim that she was raped, which was entirely false. But she was selected by the pro-abortion forces, used by them, and then used by them also to promote abortion further in the days and years after the Roe v. Wade decision. Then she changed and flip-flopped and became pro-life, and then the pro-life movement used her and her testimony and her pro-life advocacy for their cause, for the cause of life. And then supposedly on her deathbed, she said it was all just a game she was playing with the pro-life people, and she only did it for the money. So what do we do? What are we supposed to think of this woman? Now, when I heard the story of her life, and I had heard bits and pieces of her life as a pro-life Christian for decades now, I had heard something or other about Norma McCorvey and that she was actually the woman that was in the original Roe v. Wade decision, Roe, a.k.a. Jane Roe. I'd heard about that. I heard that she had become a Christian, and then I had heard that she went into the Roman Catholic Church, and then I heard different things here and there. I never really followed her, or I never really thought that she was much of a force within the pro-life movement because I just didn't know her story that much. But all I did know was that she once was pro-abortion, and now that she began to become Christian and learn Christianity, she became pro-life. And that's all I knew until I found out about her death a few years back. But then we learn now, 2 or 3 years later after her death, that supposedly she did all of that pro-life activity as just a way to make money and just to play or be played by the movement. So I think of a scripture passage in the book of James in the New Testament where it talks about a double-minded man. And it says in verse 7 of chapter 1 of the book of James, it says that man, and it had talked about someone who was not solid in their faith. It says in verse 5, let me start up there, and it says, if anyone lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him. But when he asks, he must believe and not doubt, because he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That man should not think he will receive anything from the Lord. He is double-minded man, unstable in all he does. So that last part where it talks about the double-minded man, unstable in all he does, well, that could apply also to Norma McCorvey. It seems like a double-minded woman, unstable in all she does. It seems like her life was made up of just one big series of flip-flops where she would hold to a very strong position and then all of a sudden totally dismay the people in that cause by flip-flopping and changing to the other cause. And then at this last hour that we see with this documentary, she flip-flops even on her Christian conviction of pro-life. But is that really what happened? Or is there something more? So it raises a whole lot of questions. We have to step back and say, okay, well, what is actually taking place here? It doesn't seem to add up. What is this woman actually doing at the final hour of her life? And another question raises, well, was she being manipulated and played by the documentary filmmakers at her extreme age just before she died? And maybe did she have a kind of a personality that tended to actually take the belief of the person that she's actually talking to or is dealing with at the moment? So if that is the case, if these documentary filmmakers came to her and she began to sense that they were pro-abortion, pro-feminist, radical leftists, and at her extreme age and at her moment near death, she sensed that that's what they wanted to hear. Did she give them what they wanted to hear? Like maybe she had been doing all her life in different situations. That's a question. Now, I wanted to raise some issues here, and we can talk about them here. It says, I scratched down some notes. Did she really lie when she said she opposed Roe v. Wade? And was her conversion to Christianity fake also? Is there anything you can believe that she says? Her life seems to be filled with a big series of lies that she's willing to pull over on people, basically years and decades. And so you ask the question, can we take anything that she says face value? Because, again, if you have a person who is a pathological liar or who is someone who has shown to be willing to lie all throughout their life, how do you know she's telling the truth on her deathbed? How do you know she's willing to tell the truth even about how she lied in other instances? So here is a person who tells fibs and lies, and she's telling you something, and then she's saying, well, I'm not really lying now. How do you know she's not lying? How do you know she's not resorting to whatever? If it's a defense mechanism, it's a coping mechanism. We really don't know. And even during this documentary, there were people in the documentary interviewed that said that she is a very complex person. She's a very difficult person. And if you befriend her, you are going to have a lot of challenges on your hands in dealing with her because of her complex personality. And I think one of the problems that she may have suffered all her life is somehow this inability to actually ground herself in what she really believes. And it's really hard to know what she really believed. Was she really ever pro-abortion? Did she really believe strongly from her heart that abortion should be legal? The killing of an unborn child should be legal by the mother? Or is that just something that under the right circumstances, under the right personalities around her, talking to the right people, hearing the right message, that she would succumb to and believe that until she came into another environment and talked to other different people under different circumstances, hearing a different message, and then she would take that on and think that that's what she believed. So we might be actually dealing with a woman who is actually not quite sure what her own convictions are. In other words, she doesn't even know her own mind. She doesn't know what is really important and what she really believes, even after years and even after decades. Now, most people are not like that. I mean, in fact, That's very rare that there would be someone like that. But it's conceivable that there might be actually personality types that are double-minded, like the book of James talks about. And it could be that Norma McCorvey was actually that type of a person. Let me read that passage again. In respect to this double-minded person, but when he asks, he must believe and not doubt, because he who doubts is like the wave of a sea blown and tossed by the wind. That man or woman should not think he will receive anything from the Lord. He is double-minded, unstable in all he does. And that really does seem to characterize the life of Norma McCorvey. Very unstable and very double-minded. Now, you don't want to usually accuse someone being double-minded, but if a person flip-flops quite a bit, like we see in politicians, for example, I mean, that's the stereotype, right, of a politician, where they would flip-flop on one side. You know, they were against it before they were for it, kind of a comedy routine, as some of the politicians actually say. I mean, we've seen that happen so often in politics, where someone 20 years ago is arguing strongly for one thing, and then 20 years later, they're actually embracing the opposite of what they argued. And when somebody says, hey, isn't that inconsistency? No, that's not inconsistency. I was against it before I was for it. Or, you know, just trying to rationalize changing their minds, being unstable. And what that means, what that shows me when I hear politicians do that, and we've seen a ton of Democrats do that. For example, on the so-called gay marriage thing, you know, on record, we have all of these Democrats lining up behind one another saying, no, marriage is between a man and a woman. It can only be a man and a woman. Even people like Barack Obama and people like Joe Biden in the past have said, yes, I believe in marriage as a man and a woman. And then years later, they've completely flip-flopped. And in the case of Obama, he used the euphemistic word evolve. He says, my views have evolved on this issue. In other words, but what that shows me is he didn't have core principles in his heart of hearts about these issues, and so then he could flip-flop on them. Well, it could be that Norma McCorvey is a woman who, for some reason, never developed or never held to strong core values. Maybe in her early life, it was more of a survival of the fittest. She did what she needed to do to survive, to actually just stay alive, to make a few bucks, and that she would basically tell people whatever they needed to hear to help her get her money and get her basic necessities of life taken care of. And it is a very plausible scenario that she played along with whatever group happened to be there for her at the moment, meeting her needs, giving her the resources to survive. And at first, it happened to be the pro-abortion group. They came to her. She was pregnant. They came to her and asked her, would you be on our side? Would you help us win this case? And so she hired out her services, so to speak, to the pro-abortion cause. And then after that, they kind of dropped her, and she sort of went into one of the demonstrations and showed up and said, I'm the woman in the Roe v. Wade, demanding attention. And the pro-abortion movement was very reluctant to do that and give her attention because of the way she talked and the way she acted. But a few of them were willing to take her in, and she functioned in that community for, I believe it was at least a decade or so, speaking on behalf of abortion, promoting abortion, doing everything she could to promote abortion, actually working at an abortion clinic as a counselor. And then she came under the influence of a pastor who was protesting abortion, and she befriended him, and he befriended her, and came under the influence of Christians and lo and behold, she became a Christian and became pro-life. And then she found that in that environment, if she said the right things and did the right things, she was taken care of. Now, I don't believe necessarily that she was paid to say things, but I think what happens is they paid her expenses to come to a march, or they paid her expenses to give an appearance and speak. And it's kind of like a speaker, a professional speaker. She became on the speaking lecture speakers circuit, and people can earn a living that way. And she became that, but that's different from paying her to say things that she didn't believe. And I think that if you were to ask basically all the pro-life people that came into contact with her at the time, I've never seen her speak. I have never actually seen her on video speaking out against abortion until this documentary. I saw the little clips in there. But I can well imagine that almost all of the pro-life people said, yeah, I thought she was on our side. And then perhaps what happened at the end of her life, she wasn't on any speaking tours. Her health was deteriorating. She moved into a nursing home, and she was out of the limelight, and she might have felt, sort of neglected and ignored by the pro-life movement. There might have been bitterness for that. So then she's going to decide, okay, well, I'm going to tell them it was all just for money and I didn't really believe it all anyway. Well, was that true, or was that a lie? Is it based on reacting against a perceived hurt by her, by these movements? The pro-life movement, if she was sort of neglected and people didn't watch out for her or check in with her at her old age, she might have felt hurt by the pro-life movement. But that runs contrary, because I did hear an interview of some pro-life people who said, no, we stayed in touch with her. We talked to her on the phone. We talked to her pretty close up to the time of her death, and she was still talking the same way she ever talked to us. This is a surprise to us. And so it really raises some question. Was she being manipulated by these filmmakers? That's a real possibility. Now, some other things that we have to consider. What does this mean for the pro-life movement? It really doesn't take away from the arguments and the reasons why people protest and oppose abortion. Abortion is the taking of an innocent life. Abortion is murder of the unborn child. It's a moral wrong. It was a moral wrong before anybody heard of Norma McCorvey. It was wrong before anyone of any note spoke out against it in the pro-life cause. So the arguments and the reasons to oppose abortion are still there. I think most pro-life people today, the most people that go to the March for Life in Washington, D.C., which I had the privilege of going this past January before the big pandemic. In fact, the first time I heard about the coronavirus was on the way to the March for Life at the end of January. And I heard it on the radio going to Washington in the car. I said, wait a minute, wow, that whole Wuhan is locked down. There's a virus pandemic over there. And this huge crowd of perhaps 500,000 people, and the President of the United States spoke there, and people who opposed abortion. And I don't think most of those people that went to the pro-life march in Washington this past January even knew of Norma McCorvey. I don't even think if you had asked them, they would know who that is. Now, a few would, because a few of them, the old-timers, probably remember her because she did speak one year. I think it was 1 year. She did speak for a few minutes at the march. So yeah, people know of her, but she wasn't a major influence in the pro-life movement. So it's not going to affect the pro-life argument. It's not going to affect the momentum of the pro-life movement. It's not going to, I don't think it's going to persuade anyone to not be against abortion. I think it's just the pro-life movement needs to ask this question. First of all, they need to say, hey, let's be careful that we're not putting people up in front of other people who may not be fully embracing of our cause. And I think that's the same way that the pro-abortion people were at first. They were like, we don't want her up in front. We don't really know if she's on board. And I think the pro-life people need to take that same attitude and say, look, let's not put people up in front, and let's not have people speak who we may not really think are pro-life, which is always a sound, logical policy. You want to make sure that the people who are influencing other people are actually on board, and they're not just playing you, and you're not playing them, or you're not just using them or their name or their popularity or their name brand to further your cause, because that can come back again and hurt your cause. And we've seen that in the Christian world before, where you have a new convert and all of a sudden they've lived a bad lifestyle, and all of a sudden they say, hey, I'm a born-again Christian, and then all of a sudden Christian broadcasters just throw them on television and talk to them, and everybody's listening with bated breath what they say because they're so important just because they're a celebrity. That's dangerous. And we see the situation, in fact, last year develop with the conversion of Kanye West, the rapper and producer of music. And I caution people. I say, okay, this is great, positive development, but don't get going too fast, and just let him have time to be a Christian and develop. And if this is real, it will prove itself over time. But if it's a flash in the pan, we don't want to be promoting someone who will then come back later and say, oh, that was just a phase I was going through. I'm not a real sincere Christian at all. You don't want that. So I would say that there are lessons to be learned from this. We might not ever really understand the whole situation with Norma McCorvey, but I think it's something that hopefully people will come forward who have more information on this. All of a sudden, this documentary came out and with this provocative new development, and it's like leaving people scratching their head. We don't understand. But I think eventually the truth might come out, and it might be a lot different than this. So we'll see you next time on another edition. God bless.